Welcome to Mr. Roach's Block 3 broadcast. Today, I'll be your host, James Milestone.
And I will be your host, Marissa Wang.
Today we'll be talking about racism in the modern world. Although there have been many advancements against racism, it still is present today.
Especially prevalent with the newest virus called the Wuhan virus, or the coronavirus, which originated in Wuhan, China. It's considered a disease that would be deadly, but it's treatable. It has affected many Asian families in the last month in Asia, although in this new virus came many controversial and racist assumptions about the general Asian community.
We'll begin this segment with a primary source, our very own reporter's cousin, Warissa Mang. Now we'll switch over to the interview.
Oh.
Hello, Miss Mang. I heard that you had experienced some racism in the Bay Area just recently. Could you tell us about it?
Yes. Essentially, I was out grocery shopping with my mother in Sunset, and I was walking down the street with a handful of groceries, and then suddenly I walked past this Caucasian lady, and I didn't notice anything because it was like the outbreak of the coronavirus had just started, so it was like a huge hysteria, and I didn't really touch on it. I didn't think it was that big of a deal at first, and so she walked past me, and I can hear her I can see her glaring at me, and I was kind of confused until she walked past me completely, and she was behind me. She was just like, "Oh, you like dirty Asians eating whatever you find on the ground," and I'm like, "I bought these groceries," so I was like confused. And then I went home and I found out that a lot of people were like angry about the coronavirus and blaming Asians for it, and I just didn't understand why. It was weird because I haven't been to China in a really long time. But even people that are just grouping a bunch of Asians together generally and blaming them for something that they have no control over. That's very interesting to see such blatant racism in our society today. We as a nation are oftentimes so prided on the fact that we've come so far in terms of equality. In flourishing cities like San Francisco, one of their main traits is diversity. Their diversity in culture, food, and people, of course. It's surprising that when people are faced with something of the unknown or something that might affect them, that all rationality is out the window. Those who are yelling racist things at Asians who most likely have never been to Asia, but simply because they are the same race and characteristics as those who are in Wuhan right now, is clearly xenophobic.
Now we will move on to our next section. We will be analyzing a document covering another instance of racism in the modern world. This example is the N-word.
Okay, so let's talk about a certain word, the N-word. The word itself holds a lot of history, originating in 1619 when slavery had just begun, when the first Africans reached the English colonies, arriving in Port Comfort, Virginia, near Jamestown. Slavery owners would use this word to call their slaves and other African Americans. It began with the word Negroes, but then it transitioned into others. Today, it's a word used for actually endearment, while as before it was a word of belittlement. Our society today is more knowing of this word because we are a nation, are becoming more progressive. We learned from history what this word meant and the tragedy that it carries with it. In this article, it starts off with how this word came to be an insult. Essentially, it's the attention. The word was intentionally derogatory. The fact that this word was linked to the violence and brutality of African Americans, so it makes it so a controversial issue for a non-black person to say it. It's amazing to see how much of a word can change throughout history and how we are still considerate of the initial intentions of it. It's debatable whether some people are allowed to say it because people say that it's about physical traits and others say it's about identity. That's why some people argue that they can say even if they visually don't have the characteristics of an African American.
That was very interesting. Now we will move on to our next document. Here, we will analyze the current state of racism in the workplace. The most pressing example of this is the wage gap, making it easier or harder for people of certain races to become wealthy. Looking at this graph, it's quite clear that there is still a large wage gap between race and gender. It shows the top dark dark blue line representing white men, followed by white women, black men, then black women. It appears that there's a large gap between the white men's line and the other lines on the graph. Additionally, there have been little to no changes in this gap since 2000. The lack of change shows a lack of effort from company owners and other people in charge of wages. Moving into the new decade, we hope to see the wages come closer together. Lastly, we are going to talk about the presence of racism in stereotypes. This is an example of how racism is present in small situations between people every day. People often make assumptions about different races and ethnicities. These are called stereotypes. They happen as a result of commonalities or straight lies about races. In class, we used the example that Asians can't drive. Another student followed, saying that this is somewhat truthful from her experiences, but this is not always the case. Saying that all Asians are bad at driving generalizes them, which is a stereotype. In order to avoid stereotyping, people need to be more open-minded and see that people are individuals rather than just part of a big group. Bringing all of our research together, we've noticed that racism is still very well present, but it surely has decreased since Reconstruction. First, we had the woman who lived in the Bay Area report her experience. She talked about how someone called her out for being a certain race. This is the most direct form of racism that we have seen, where people state what they think straight to someone's face. Secondly, we covered the current debate about usage of the N-word. People still aren't sure whether it's a derogatory term or a term of endearment. Some people also aren't sure about who's allowed to say it and if it depends on their nationality, ethnicity, or race. Next, we covered the wage gap and the little change in the wage gap over the past few years. It is evident that white males are making much more money than those of other races. Lastly, we talked about stereotyping, which is essentially categorizing people or making assumptions about them based on their race or sex. It's terrible that each of these are still present in the modern world and have gone unfixed. In the very least, we can state that things have improved since Reconstruction after the Civil War. During Reconstruction, racism was still present even though all were made equal before the law. Despite the legislative government passing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, black codes and segregation laws such as Jim Crow laws were still enacted by the states. Since then, activists have pointed out the flaws in our government, trying to fix the new problems that avoided the law. Racism is still present in smaller interactions rather than blatant segregation and other large issues. The differences are still present. A great example of this is the workplace. During Reconstruction, different races were forced into worse work conditions than others and paid little to nothing. Now, many more people face realistic work conditions and good pay, but other countries are taken advantage of. Though these issues have been pointed out, there is still much more to do before these problems will be fixed.